Welcome back, talking about the podcast Cold with host Dave Cawley. My name's Becky Bruce. Right now we're talking about episode 9 of season number 3. I thought that we were kind of done with Chuck Warren, and all of a sudden, with this episode, he's back.
He is.
And he takes a huge center stage. So were you ever really able to rule Chuck out as a suspect?
No. Charles Chuck Warren, Sheree's estranged husband, to this day, cannot be ruled out as a suspect in her disappearance. And that's one of the big problems with this case. You have 2 plausible persons of interest, Charles Warren and Sheree's boyfriend, Kerry Hartman. Now, Charles Warren stopped talking to police very early in the investigation. And in a lot of ways, his attitude reminded me of another case that I covered in Cold Season 1, Josh Powell. Josh Powell acted a lot like Chuck Warren in saying, he did a couple cursory interviews in the beginning with police, and when it became clear he was a suspect, he invoked his right to remain silent, and that was it. He was done. No more talking. In the eyes of law enforcement, that makes you look pretty suspicious. And Charles Warren, many years later, as we hear in this episode, finally talks, and it's recorded, and we get to hear what he says. And I don't think he was totally honest with what he said in this interview. So no, he is still a suspect.
Well, speaking of things that he may or may not have been honest about, why were the checkbooks such a good, important focal point for you?
So the question is, Sheree Warren's car ends up in Las Vegas after she disappeared. How did it get there? Charles Warren has opportunity, potentially, to travel on the railroad because he works for the railroad. So investigators have wondered, could he have hopped a train and gone back and forth? There were some indications in his bank records that he had made transactions in Nevada days, weeks after Sheree disappeared. So those needed to be accounted for. When he was interviewed, the detective confronted him about that. Hey, I've got your bank records. They show this transaction, that transaction. What was going on? Where were you? Make it make sense. Tell me a story that doesn't involve you taking the car to Las Vegas. And Charles Warren did have a story, but it needs to be verified. And so that's why his checkbooks became a focal point of the investigation at that point.
The fingerprint on the car window, to me, was one of those moments where I felt like most listeners would probably be crying out in frustration with me as they're listening. Why wasn't that followed up on? How did the car wind up back with the Warrens? So many questions that I have about that car not being in evidence and provided to the police department here in Utah.
Yeah.
What's your take?
Sheree Warren's car, when it was discovered in November of 1985, hundreds of miles away from where it was last seen when she disappeared in Salt Lake City, obviously a critical piece of evidence in this case. It should have been taken into evidence and held for all these years, but it wasn't. The car was registered to Sheree's estranged husband, Charles. And once the car was processed by Las Vegas Metro PD and the FBI, they turned it over to Charles Warren. And that car's gone. Nobody can find it now. All we know, the only piece of evidence that we have, is this fingerprint that was taken off of one of the windows. Maybe Sheree's, maybe not. That fingerprint was sitting in Las Vegas Metro Police evidence for decades. It never made it back to Utah until just a couple of years ago when we started looking at this case. Roy City Police reopened the cold case investigation. I can't tell you whose print it is, but it's baffling to me that we don't still have that car and we can't use modern technology and techniques to try to see if there's any evidence in it.
Well, and a case in point with that jurisdictional concern that Carl Marino brings up. When you add Las Vegas to the mix, that's one more department now involved in this massive, confusing investigation that crosses jurisdictions. Does that make it harder to ultimately solve the case?
It does. I think what we see happen in so many cold cases is a problem called data silo. So one police department has a set of records. They have an investigation. They want to make sure that that is not compromised by putting information out. So they put up barriers to other, agencies, the public knowing information. Well, there has to be some amount of information that travels back and forth between police agencies that are cooperating on an investigation for it to work. And what we see happen in this case is that Roy Police, Salt Lake City Police, the FBI, all of these different agencies struggle to share information. And so I think that's part of why we see Sheree Warren's car sit in Las Vegas until it's given back to her estranged husband and it ultimately disappears.
How can I listen to the podcast?
All right, we're coming down to the end, but Cold Season 3, Episode 9 available now for free anywhere you get your podcasts. If you want to finish out the season, if you're an Amazon Prime member, you can hop ahead and listen to Episode 10 as well.